Welcome back to another episode of the Twin Elements podcast, proudly presented by Venture Hunting and Outdoors. If you're like us and passionate about hunting, spearfishing, and many other outdoor-related pursuits, with an eagerness to fast-track your learning, then this podcast is perfect for you. G'day legends, and welcome back to another episode of the Twin Elements podcast. Today marks our very first podcast to drop in 2026, so I hope that everyone had a Merry Christmas and a great New Year to cap off what was a pretty good all-round 2025 for us here at Twin Elements. We got in plenty of hunting opportunities, made plenty of memories, and hope to obviously repeat that heading on here into 2026. Today, we shift the discussion to Cape York in North Queensland, Australia, where James and I recently hunted tusky boars at Kayuga Adventures. We were also joined by our father, Nick Doumtsis, who many of you, when you listen to the podcast, will be well familiar with our father by now. As well as two Australian-based hunters, Matt Moore and Brad Smith, who I'm sure many of you know about as well. This episode is part one of a three-part series dedicated to basically Cape York related podcasts. So make sure that you guys subscribe to the podcast to keep up to date with the fresh releases over the coming weeks. In this episode, we will introduce hunting possibilities in Cape York, Australia, as well as share some successful stories from a week of bow hunting action. As always, we will conclude the show with a couple of your listener FAQs, or frequently asked questions, which have been sent in. If you have a question, please email us at info@twinelements.com.au with the subject line FAQ, or you can send us a question to either our Instagram, Facebook, any of our social media accounts through either Twin Elements, Ayden Doumtsis Outdoors, or James Doumtsis Outdoors. And as always, we will strive to get back to you. Without further ado, we'll jump into the podcast. Huntingful is the foremost hunting resource with varied levels of membership to get you on your next adventure. If you've seen some of our recent USA-based adventures and that's got you thinking about a hunt of your own, then listen up. Whether it be an eagerness towards planning annual trips or you're more time poor and want to plan towards a bigger, once-in-a-lifetime adventure, you're in the right place. Huntingful and the consultancy team will cater to your needs regardless of your desired hunt. James and I have been utilising their services for a couple of years now, and virtually all of our USA adventures are shaped by the guidance of our friends, the Huntingful advisors. Not sure where to start when planning a USA hunt? No problem. Not sure how to apply for tags? No dramas. Simply set a budget and have a general idea of what species you want to hunt, and the team at Huntingful will start narrowing the hunt to your preferences. If you're interested in using Huntingful's license application services to draw more tags across the Western United States, then email applications@huntingful.com and start the conversation today. Mention Twin Elements to get 25% off your first year of service. The Huntingful team will take it from there. Alrighty, so this is the first of our Kayuga Adventures podcasts, and if you're not familiar with Kayuga Adventures, it's a bow hunting only camp that's run up north in Cape York. So many of you would have heard about the infamous Cape York. It's often referred to as Australia's top end or in the Gulf. So Cape York is located in North Queensland, Australia. From a hunter and adventurer's perspective, Cape York is honestly one of those places that just represents wild, remote country. It's very pure in that sense that there's honestly, once you go past sort of the bitumen roads, there's not really much up there except for cattle stations and people doing, similar things. Like a lot of it is based around that rural, remote, rugged sort of way of life, with the odd little outhouse and station, the odd little petrol station up north just to keep people going. And it really isn't the case, except for a bit of tourism that keeps it a bit busy. Otherwise, it'd be one of those like untouched places on Earth where, almost if you leave it for too long, say over the wet season, the wild will truly just come back and reclaim, civilization at quite a quick and alarming rate. So one of the other really cool things about Cape York is purely just the amount of wildlife. There's crocodiles up there, snakes, amphibians, birds, plenty of different wallabies and kangaroo species. But what sort of draws us up there to Cape York is, as hunters, is the feral pigs and scrub bulls. And primarily on this hunt, what you're going to hear about is our recounts of hunting the feral pigs. But one thing that I just want to get across here is that stalking and hunting up here in Cape York isn't really comparable to a lot of other places. For one, you don't really have, at least where we were hunting, where a lot of the country is quite thick, dense sort of woodland that gets onto really tight creeks that might bend and arch and sort of snake their way around through the landscape every 100 or so meters. You don't really get a grasp of what's in front of you, and you're sort of at the mercy of the wind. So rather than being able to get up high on first light and sort of see and survey the whole countryside around you, glassing from like a ridge line, it's very, very slight undulating topography. So there's certainly areas that are lower that, might be a bit of a swamp or a wetland or a floodplain or something like that. But most of it is this open sort of dry, savanna-like country. And one thing that's consistent is that a lot of the hunting is very close quarters, like you're moving through these pandanus thickets or these paperbark thickets or whatever sort of vegetation it is, and it's physical, like you're getting scratched up by leaves, branches, bugs, getting spider webs all over you, and then add to that it's extremely hot and humid. And often, as I'm sort of describing there, it's very, very tight country. So what you have to do is be able to read sign really, really well. Like if you come across a fresh pad, you've got to be able to identify that because it's often leading between, these food sources and then water sources. And again, you then add another layer of complexity to that, and you've got to be able to read the wind really well. So there's no point being able to read sign and walk with the wind on your back. And that's often the case in Cape York, which gets really, really frustrating. So again, you've got to have a level of patience. And a lot of it is being able to really thread that shot when the time comes. Like there's no point being able to shoot out to 30, 40 meters because a lot of it, like from what we experienced, was done at very close distances in very obscure shot angles with boars bedded in creeks along water sources, or sometimes even feeding on carcasses. And it seemed to be one of those things where you walk all day or you drive by car and travel a lot of kilometres, and then suddenly there's this boar in front of you at 8 yards in an obscure angle, and you've got to make the most of it, read what sort of position they're laying in, and then be able to trust your gear and make that shot count. So one of the, unspoken allures of Cape York is, as I said, the remoteness. And as you'll hear in next week's podcast where James talks a little bit about Cape York, you're basically a long way from help. So being diligent with the right safety gear, all that type of stuff, is always at the forefront and is essential when travelling up north. Fortunately for us, we were hunting with Maddie Moore, who runs a really tight outfitter and group there at Kayuga Adventures. So he has things like his vehicles all prepped. He's got, even just making sure of water management, making sure you've got enough water in your camelbacks in the car. All these, backups in case something does go wrong is important. Making sure that you're knowing where you're going and navigating is important because you can get lost so easily. And if you get lost, that's a quick way to, being in trouble. And then, as I've sort of said, making sure that you trust your gear. It all makes a huge difference in the, results and how the trip plays out. So with the current setting of this hunt, the days were extremely hot, and basically that didn't really ease up even into the night. We had a few nights of rain over this trip, and in all honesty, it didn't really cool things down. If anything, it just made it more hot and humid, which, was actually a bit disappointing because it scattered the pigs, made conditions a bit more hard, but it was just something that we had to deal with, and it made the hunt quite interesting. It's currently the wet season now, in January, as I'm recording this from my home here in Townsville. And each and every day over the summer months, without fail, there's pretty much rainfall, whether it's 5 mils, 10 mils, 20 mils, 30 mils, whatever it may be. There is some form of rainfall. Again, it's sort of replicating that feeling from the trip that we did back in November. And, basically from December through till February up here in Queensland, like I'm in Townsville, which is, I think it's about 10 hours south of where we were hunting up in Cape York. So it's a long way away, but the climate is pretty much the same. It's hot, sticky, wet this time of year. And basically the same can be said for Cape York. I've actually had to postpone a hunt with Spotted Safaris, the guiding that I do, purely because we're now rained out of the property. 2 days ago, the property was all good. We could get out there, drive out there. We would have been able to hunt, drive around. And then in a day, it basically rained a couple hundred mils further west. That flooded a river, and then that river's broke its banks and the road's now cut off. And I'm sure that in 2 days, 3 days after recording this podcast, everything will be back down to normal. But that's just the reality of that time of the year and the wet season. So naturally, that hunt that we were doing in November is very much what Brad and Matt would call a late season sort of style of hunt. And it's one of those hunts where we knew what the factors were going into it. We sort of chose that time of year just because we thought the boars might be more and more concentrated to the last remaining water. But we were very much playing a roll of the dice in the sense of if it did rain, especially if it rained a week before the trip, those pigs, those animals that were reliant on water would have been able to go anywhere, feed anywhere because of the short grass that would have been influxed and growing in random spots. Plus there would have been water on the landscape. So it's important to know that, especially because up here, I guess in Australia's north, the seasons sort of change the landscape very, very quickly. As I said there, 100 mils of rain over a couple of days can completely change and dictate how animals live, move, survive. And that's important for understanding the nature of this hunt. To give you guys, our listeners, a bit of a timeline. So if we start from now, January 2026, it's the wet season. It's just going to be bucketing down with rain over the next probably 2 months. It's then going to slowly peter off. But there's going to be so much moisture in the ground that all of our native, plants and vegetation is truly going to bounce back. So what country was, dry in November when we did this hunt is now probably a picture perfect green, scenic sort of looking countryside. That countryside is just going to keep growing with the heat and humidity and the moisture in the air and the soil. Those plants are well and truly loving life. Keep in mind that it's also the summer months at the moment, which means that there is plenty of sunlight when it's not raining. So again, it's going to be like a greenhouse. And over the next few months, especially in Feb, March, April, the countryside is just going to go boom. And honestly, there'll be grass sometimes up to knee waist height that the animals are now, who are basically starving in November, are now going to have an abundance of feed and water on the landscape. Where it starts to get interesting is sort of after, I'd say, March. Most of the actual rainfall sort of starts to cease, and you do get the odd, rain event that's unusual, and you might get a big downpour of, 50 mils, 100 mils, whatever it may be. But it's what we'd then consider unseasonal as it goes into that April, May, June, July period. And certainly by July, you don't really get rainfall right up until November. So if you can imagine, all of the, vegetation is growing like crazy, using up all the resources, using the sun, photo period, all the moisture in the air, water, and the soil to grow. By about June, July, they haven't had any new water on the landscape. So what begins to happen is areas that aren't directly touching water, so areas that aren't around creeks, low-lying floodplains, swamps, whatever that sort of country might be, really begin to start to dry out. And what happens is a lot of those grasses lose their nutrition. So a lot of those grass might be, knee high to waist high still. And for certain animals, say it's a cow, they might walk through there and still browse a little bit of that leaf material, but they're going to be less inclined to eat that, especially if it's like brown, dry, brittle and stalky. What they're looking for is that shorter green pick that's sort of receding and growing as those water sources start to dry out. And again, even in June, July, August, you start getting animals switching from a reliance on, what was once water before the wet season, and now they're primarily focusing on food sources. And that's one thing that in the next couple of episodes we'll talk more and more about, and just all the different abundance, I guess, of natural bush tuckers that are out there in the form of different fruits, seeds, plants, reeds, all those different things that the pigs up there have learned to basically survive off at different times of the year, whether it be fig trees, bush apples, whatever it may be. At certain times of the year when those things flower, it's basically like a lifeline to get these animals through, especially when the seasons are tough during the dry months. So fast forward from July, August, you're starting to get out of that, what we'd call the early season, when conditions are pretty good. There's a lot of animals breeding, a lot of cover around, things are just starting to dry up. And then as you get into September, October, and then pushing it right through till November, it's at this time of the year, in my opinion, that bow hunting can be some of the best and most productive, purely because a lot of that countryside, for one, is starting to dry out, and areas that were simply inaccessible you can now drive to. And then actually get out and start your hunt and be able to cover a bit more country. But two, rather than having 100% of the countryside just full of water, green grass, all the resources that these pigs need, like they don't have to go and bed in one spot. They can literally just bed down where they're eating because there's so much cover. Now, by this time of the year, say, October, November, especially, with a lot less water on the landscape, that restricts them to a certain area. And then once you target where the water is, you can then target the food sources within X amount of kilometres from those water sources, knowing that pigs don't want to just go and spend up their energy and deplete their energy levels by travelling 20 kilometres to a food source. If there's food and water within a kilometre of each other and a nice adequate bedding area, that's where those animals are going to be. And that's sort of the game plan that we had heading into this trip. For us, everything revolved around food sources and water sources. So any remaining pools and puddles of water in the creeks, springs and soaks became absolute magnets for wildlife. In these spots, one of the first things that you see is the game trails just deepen, in the sense that it's similar to when I did a podcast last year on the Northern Territory. As soon as you are out in these remote landscapes and you're travelling vast distances in very dry climates, especially over that dry season when it hasn't rained for a few months, when there is an area where there's an animal going from its feeding or bedding area to water, they do so in the most direct line of travel. And that often results in lots of animals moving over the same path every single day. And those game trails, as a result, go from being, say surface level to sometimes a couple of centimetres, if not inches thick. And the dust, rather than being a hard game trail, turns into almost bull dust, purely because that dirt has been trodden on by hard hooves so many times. So again, the sign begins to concentrate. In the way of pigs, you'll have mud on trees, branches, you'll have tracks on the ground, you'll have tusk and hook marks on trees, signaling that there are boars in the area. There'll be a bit more rutting. There'll be crap and feces on the ground, as well as beds and things leading from their feeding to their bedding areas, where animals are just going to, try and stay close to these resources as they literally dry up. They don't really have the luxury of wandering around like they did earlier in the year. And that also means that, for us as people that are hunting there for the first time in this instance, we can sort of cross off a lot of country. Like what we did as a strategy was basically just circle and put pins in water sources and swamps and green areas, and then go from there, and basically, also with the assistance of Brad, who was helping us on this trip, basically just get directed straight to areas that were super likely because they had food and water.
When you're out hunting, your camouflage needs to blend in or cost you opportunities. That's why I run Numa camouflage clothing. Built for hunters who push hard, Numa is quiet, durable, and designed to disappear in everything from open tussock to thick mountain terrain. Whether you're heading out on a multi-day hunt, glassing big country, or slogging it out in the rain, Numa keeps you dry, comfortable, and helps you push further. So if you're gearing up for your next adventure, check out the full range at Venture Hunting and Outdoors and level up your hunting kit with Numa. Built for the outdoors, built for the hunt.
I know that I've sort of, said a lot of pros as to why, as it gets drier and drier, it probably sounds like we're shooting fish in a barrel here. But this time of year, especially in November, it does come with its own challenges. So the primary challenge pretty much in general for Cape York, but especially that time of the year, being so late and, at the end of the dry, just about building up to the wet season, is managing the actual wind. So as the year ticks along, trade winds basically decrease. And where we were hunting was probably 100 kilometres both east and west from the coast. So we were in the middle of the Gulf, in the middle of Cape York. And when people look at Queensland on the map, you've got that tiny little tip up the very top north of northeast Queensland. If you go and draw, a dot in the middle, that's pretty much where we were. And that gives you hundreds of kilometres of bush. But it also, as I said, with the trade winds, they basically diminish to not really having a persistent wind. And basically it results in it not being uncommon for us to be walking a certain direction with the wind on our face, only for it to swirl literally 100 metres into the walk or the hunt. So you'd basically do this big lap or big drive or big walk or whatever to get the wind in your face, only for 100 metres into the stalk for it to be blowing a gale on your back, ruining all that untouched area in front of you. And basically, as you try and correct this and alter the course, change, the wind, the direction you're going to go. If it's a creek and you've gone up creek, and you now want to go down the creek, you literally try and change that, and then the wind swirls and blows literally the other direction, a full 180. And honestly, on this hunt, the most common cause of a failed stalk for us was certainly the change of wind direction, and basically that leading to animals, in the case of us, feral pigs, departing the scene. So this was so much to the point that, if you guys have seen, listened, watched any of our YouTube videos, you would know that we rely pretty heavily on our wind puffers. We often use them a lot just to dictate, the direction that we want to go. If that's iffy, we'll do something to correct it. We're trying to always check the thermals, knowing the wind direction ahead of time, all these sorts of things. But on this particular hunt, we honestly hardly even used our wind puffers. The strategy was pretty much that when we spied a bedded boar, we would basically just assume that the wind was good at the time, and we were hoping that it was going to hold, and then we would basically run in as quick as possible, as silently as possible, as calculated as possible, and try and capitalize on that opportunity. There was no point going, get the wind puffer out. Oh, is the wind good? Oh, no, it's pretty dog shit. Nothing really changed what you were doing. Like, we just took it as, there's a pig at 60 metres. I've now got to make up 40 metres and get in as quick and quietly as I can before the wind sort of swirls. Which basically, as I said there, like, there was no point factoring the wind into the stalks. Like, you did your best to navigate the day and choose a bit of a direction based on what, inputs we were getting as to what the wind was doing most consistently. But then once you were sort of on the stalk, unless it blew a certain direction for, half an hour, you just became used to it sort of blowing the wrong way for 5-10 minute periods, 100 meters, and then it'd change again. Often you'd walk and say you veered slightly right down the creek and the wind was wrong for that. As soon as you veered left the next 100 meters, it would be perfect and in your face. And then you'd change and move slightly right again and it was terrible on your back, and then you'd move left again on the next corner and it was perfect again. And you just had to live with it. Like, there was nothing you could really do. Say you try to do a big loop to get the wind right to hunt that little right bend of the creek, you'd just find that by doing that, you were further away from the creek and your wind still blew over it anyway. So another, obvious challenge for us at this time of the year, that is quite specific to November, especially towards the end of the year, the end of the dry season, going into summer, is the stifling heat and humidity. So as I said, November is the build up to the wet season. So although it hasn't actually rained yet, in our case, they hadn't really got any rain prior to us arriving on the trip, which is a really good thing. The heat and humidity definitely makes everything more and more uncomfortable. For us, we were sleeping in, great accommodation and beds, but simply waking up in the morning, it felt like you were, stepping out of an oven, like you were drained of energy almost, like you just literally wanted to grab a bottle of water and scull it, because even throughout the night, you would find that, with the fans on, there was no aircon, but you were basically sweating. Like it was just hot, stifling conditions. And even at night, you didn't really get any of that relief. So to put it into perspective, most of the days that we were there, it was mid 30 degrees Celsius, up to about 40 degrees Celsius on the high days, with extremely high UV index, and just, that sun basically cooked you. And as I was sort of saying, and on a lot of these hunts, when it's hot and humid, you physically can't really drink enough water to stay hydrated, like whether it's through just becoming dehydrated from not drinking enough or simply losing all your salts and liquid through sweating. You're playing a, downhill game of trying to keep hydrated and ready to go for that next opportunity. Alrighty, so now that we've given you guys a little bit of a background into where Cape York is, the conditions, landscape, time of year, seasons, all those sorts of things, that sort of brings us into story time for the podcast, where I'm going to jump in and break down a few of my successful hunts from this trip. So the first day for me started off with some dog and gun coffee, of course. As a general rule, the mornings were pretty slow and steady at Kayuga Adventures. The boys really emphasize that, when you first wake up, again, it's hot and humid. It's always hot and humid. There's no real cool, active part of the morning, cool, active part of the evenings as such. It's just hot and humid that time of year. So what the boys do is they generally get us to shoot our bows when there's absolutely no wind, when it's extremely still and quiet. You basically go through, sharpen broadheads, check your arrows, shoot your bows, have a bit of a, get everything ready for the day, make some meals, fill up your water, all those sorts of things. In our case, we did a little bit of filming, and we basically just waited for the wind to stabilize and the temperature to go from, mid 20s to 35, 40. From there, it's generally mid-morning, and on this particular day, we set off towards a remote spring in a distant corner of the property that Brad was pretty excited to go and check out. He hadn't really been there for a couple of weeks with any clients, as it was towards the end of the year, and they generally try and rest areas between clients. So as it turned out, this spot hadn't really been hunted for about a month or so. Simply driving out there, it's honestly a bit of an adventure in its own right. We were cruising on dirt roads, looking out left, right, spotting scrub bulls, wild horses, and plenty of native birds, wallabies, kangaroos, you name it. There's always something cool to look at, even in such remote countryside and with so much thick scrub and sort of dry savanna woodlands. It doesn't take much to be able to see wildlife. And anyway, after X amount of kilometres, we ended up arriving at our destination and we left the car. And what we did was a bit of a loop just to get the wind right, or as right as possible. And we started heading down a bit of a spring system where the wind sort of permitted. And looking on maps, James and I, because it was a new area to us, were obviously going on the guidance of Brad as someone that guides on the place for Kayuga Adventures. So he knew where we were going, but James and I were just trying to look on maps and assess sort of what's around it, what sort of country looks like. And very quickly you could see that the surrounding countryside was dry, brown, savanna, grasslands and woodlands. And then on maps you could see this thick band of trees that surrounded this spring-like creek system. So obviously that gave me a lot of confidence, as it told me that the animals from the nearby surrounding sort of area would come into a lot closer vicinity and would have made their way from, in the morning, if they were up and feeding away from that spring where there was very little likely surface water, they would now by this time of the morning be heading in to that shade of the creek, looking for water and basically bedding areas for that midday sort of heat. So after a few hundred meters, we'd removed our boots. James and I wore our lower Ranger boots, and pretty quickly for this style of hunting, just realized that whilst they were comfortable, they were just super noisy. And because it was going to be that we basically would see a boar, whip our shoes off and sneak in, even just untying our shoes for 10, 15 seconds, that delay could have been the difference between getting winded. So what we did was actually ditch our boots after the first day, and we then made, all our tracks and movements in Crocs and socks. So that's a pretty sexy sort of combination if anyone can picture it. We've got plenty of photos that we'll share across our Instagram and socials and whatever. But yeah, we were basically just wearing Crocs, great aerated, not the most comfortable shoes in the sense of doing long days, but you just put up with it in the sense that they could easily get wet, go through mud, water, whatever, and they were easy to whip off and on. You simply, unbuckled, took them out of four-wheel drive, and then we were in our socks, which we were using as that last little bit of the approach on that really, really dry leaf litter. So this was a pretty new dynamic way of stalking for us. It allowed for us to be pretty comfortable hunting, and the ability for us to slip off our boots in the final stages of the stalk once a boar was spotted just made it a lot more likely that we're going to be able to get in quickly and make something happen. So coming around one of the many corners of the spring, we actually heard something prior moving off in some of the leaf litter ahead. And whilst we couldn't actually see what it was, we went a little bit forward, edged a little bit closer, and that tipped us off to a boar who had just slipped into what was actually a mostly dry sort of wallow amongst a little bit of surface water there just off the spring. And I think what we heard was him just laying down, getting in and under a lot of the leaves and debris. And from where we could actually see him, it was probably only 50 meters away. So we didn't actually have to go too much further to be able to get a shot. But glassing him in his bed, the way he was laying, he was on a very obscure angle. And at first impression, you would look at him and just be like, oh, beautiful. He's broadside. I'll be able to shoot him there pretty easily. But what was the main difficulty was getting an actual clear laneway to the boar. So I was able to actually pretty easily sneak into 30 meters. And as I was umming and ahhing about the shot placement, I decided that from my position, as I said, the shot was a bit more obscure than first sort of seen or first realized from 50 meters away. And the way that the boar was bedded, there wasn't actually an ethical shot even at 30 meters now with a clear shooting lane through his shoulder. So the way he was laying was sort of, if you can imagine a boar perfectly broadside and then tilted away from me, the way he was laying, he was almost rolled up and away, leaning away. So from my perspective, where the arrow needed to hit him was right on the waterline or the line of where he was laying in those leaves and a bit of mud. But where it would have entered, it would have actually, the way he was laying, sort of because he was rolling away from me, entered sort of middle on the body on one side, and then on the exit, it actually would have hit really high on the offside shoulder. So most likely only taking out one lung and potentially not being a lethal shot. So in my mind, I was like, okay, that's not good enough. Again, this boar had no idea I was there because, to that point, he was oblivious, laying in his bed, wallow, whatever you want to call it, sleeping. So unfortunately, whilst I'm sort of working this out and trying to look, do I go, keep going closer, try to basically get closer and above him so I can shoot down furthermore into where he was. Part of the issue as well was that we were almost on the same level. If he was, 30 meters away and down in that soak in the spring or the creek, I would have been able to shoot from the top bank down, and the way he was laying would have been perfect. But because we're on even, topography or even sort of slope, again, this shot basically, I could have definitely put the arrow where I wanted to, but it wouldn't have been the right shot. And as is the case with Cape York. Unfortunately, the wind swirled and that boar basically raced out of his wallow, disappearing into the surrounding scrub, happy to live another day. So rather than, I guess, overreact and change the strategy too greatly because the wind had just swirled, we actually continued on, going down the way that we'd just been moving. And for us, it was a great indication that we were in the right spot. Generally in these sort of landscapes, when you find one pig or one boar, you don't have to go too much further to sort of find another boar. Like they're all chasing the same things. And because again, as I said earlier in the background, briefing, when they're chasing food sources and water sources, and at November, that time of the year, there's so little of both, all the animals are going to be in the same sort of spot. So we were still seeing sign which dictated that we were in the right area. One of the, I guess, most interesting things for me, or the hardest thing to sort of get my head around, was actually the noise and just moving across that landscape. So with the drier conditions after what had been a long, hot, dry season without any rain or water, there was a huge leaf dump by many of the big, large, overhanging trees. And what I mean by leaf dump is a lot of those large trees, especially, trees like native gums and eucalypts, many of these trees become, I guess, stressed by the dry conditions, and in a bit of a coping mechanism, maybe to, get through the year and get through till when they can, I guess, rejuvenate themselves in the wet season, they drop their leaves. And that stress, and when they drop their leaves, often under all these big trees, which are along the edges of the creeks and waterways and things, it just leads to like an abundance and just outwardly annoying amount of leaves that scatter across the ground. And what might have once had game trails now is just covered with leaves. So there's basically no quiet place that you can put your foot and have a footfall land without being incredibly crunchy and noisy. And navigating this was extremely difficult. And to be honest, the main strategy for us is obviously to walk on the game trails and be quiet and, just move where there's less leaves. That wasn't really the case. So what we tried to do was, when the wind blew, creating sort of, I guess, ambient noise with whatever trees and branches were, had leaves on them, we would try and utilize that and maximize that as a bit of a noise concealment. But interestingly, especially this is what I sort of guess I found out as the trip went on, what I personally began to realize was that when it came to moving more unnoticed by less animals, I guess, what we were doing, especially when we'd find like a mob of sows or young boars or even scrub bulls that we weren't looking to shoot because we were trying to target mature boars on this Kayuga Adventures trip, what we would do is, rather than sort of slow down and take one step, glass the animals, take one step, glass the animals, take one step, then glass, the sort of more moderately paced that we walked, and if we moved naturally past them as if we were like another mob of animals or a mob of pigs or a pig walking along the long, dry grass or the leaf litter, those animals seemed to be less interested, and we certainly didn't get picked up or noticed as much. And it was interesting that this also, like, seeing that in the flesh dictated how we then moved as a group. Because again, we often had Dad with us. We had Brad with us. It was James and I filming each other. So there were basically at most times 4 people. And then you add 4 people's movements over this dry, crunchy leaf litter, and that's a whole lot of noise. So we, changed from moving, one step, where eventually you'd probably more likely get done by the wind, to just sort of walking at a bit of a steady pace, seeing the pig, trying to be as slow as possible, and then reading their body cues and getting on them as, I guess, efficiently as possible. Simply put, Kayuga broadheads are one of my favourite bits of archery equipment. Engineered for success and built by experience. Not only are these broadheads the best in the business, the team behind the brand are full of great, generous people who support hunting here in Australia and beyond. Put simply, we trust Kayuga broadheads for all of our bow hunts. Whether it's giant buffalo and bangtang bulls in Australia's Northern Territory, or nimble chittledeer stags along the basalt wall, we have ultimate confidence in their range. Hell, James and I have taken these Aussie-made broadheads across the world to the USA and taken critters such as elk, mule deer and pronghorn. I'm currently loving the 150 grain Zots. These incredible two-blade heads come shaving sharp out of the packet. They have field point precision, and if you're like me, love how simple they are to resharpen for the next hunt. Regardless of your preferred broadhead, quality and performance is guaranteed across the whole Kayuga range. If you would like to try them today or shoot them already and simply want to restock, then please head on over to their website and use code TWIN10. That's TWIN10, 10 numerically at checkout for 10% off your next order. Let them know we sent you and join in the Kayuga Broadheads community. You won't be disappointed. As the afternoon progressed and a number of mature boars unfortunately fled the scene due to a shifting wind, we ultimately decided to change things up and actually turn around, do a complete 180 and head upstream. And to do this, again, as I said, was a bit of a unwanted thing. Like ideally you just sort of walk a bit of a system so that you've got all fresh country in front of you. But what we ended up doing was a massive loop back, sort of bush bashing to where we started before slowing down and then hunting new country in front of us about 2 Ks away. So on the way back, we actually stumbled across what first pointed us in the right direction, I guess, were a few crows just perched up in one tree. And honestly, this seemed to be a bit of a theme of the trip. Again, just reading the body language and signalment of other creatures and being aware of your surroundings. We saw 2 crows and they were a bit reluctant to fly off. And normally, I don't know if other people have been in the bush much, but when a crow sees you, whether it's from 50 meters away, 100 meters away, 300 meters away, they don't really want to be around humans. There's some sort of thing where in their, instincts, they just know that we're bad news for them, and crows, ravens, whatever it may be, always seem to want to keep their distance. And these 2 just stayed perched up in that tree for a little bit longer than they normally would. And basically, I just put this down to them acting a little bit interested in something that was going on back in the creek. So we actually crept in a little bit closer for a look. The wind wasn't too bad, and to be honest, I was actually assuming that there was going to be a bedded boar, there under the bank, or that there was going to be, a spillage of water that the crows were trying to drink at, or perhaps something like a carcass. And in all honesty, I was actually a little bit surprised when it wasn't until I got pretty close, probably about 10, 15 meters away, that I actually laid my eyes on a red bit of fur or a red bit of hair, and straight away I knew it wasn't a pig, but it was actually a scrub bull. And then it wasn't until I could get a little bit higher, sort of up over this little sandy bank, I realized that it was a young scrub bull laying stuck on its side. So unfortunately, this young bull had become what we call cast. And that's, again, like a bit of a veterinary term, or a term that, landowners might use for their cattle. And basically being cast means that scrub bull would have bedded down, and whatever way they sort of fold their legs under them is normally how they just immediately are able to stand back up. And he would have bedded down in the shade because it would have been a good little spot, and then basically become stuck due to how his legs lay underneath him. And it's pretty unfortunate because this scrub bull didn't really, look malnourished or anything like that. I dare say it was more just the fact that he probably chose somewhere close to water in a bit too thick of a sandy spot. Maybe he was a little bit malnourished being the end of the season, but either way, this young scrubber wasn't able to get back to his feet and had virtually become stuck. And he was sort of laying on his side, legs outstretched, neck extended as well. And the tricky thing is trying to dictate, I guess, how long he'd been laying stuck there on his side for. And for us, it was unclear. So, you've got to, I guess, take into account then a number of factors. But in this heat and caught in the sun, like where he was now laying, there wasn't any sun. So where he'd obviously been there for at least a couple of hours. But he was pretty worse for wear. We actually tried to get him back up onto his sort of feet by swinging off his horns, and I tried to pull him around from his tail and lift his tail, yet he was pretty firmly stuck in that sand. It was dry sand, but just with his weight, the fact that he wasn't really giving us any effort, and we also noticed a bit of a frothy foam coming from his mouth and his nostrils, plus there were actually some wear and tear marks along his back and the underside of his legs where he'd obviously been struggling and thrashing around. After trying to get him up with no real improvement in the situation, unfortunately we made the decision to ultimately euthanize him, just to avoid any further stress or struggle on his behalf. So whilst this was, I guess, hard to see, it did remind us of the reality of this landscape and this climate, where animals were literally fighting for their life every single minute of every single day out there, just literally waiting for the rain and for the life that it brings. So whilst we were sort of relieved that it hadn't really rained and that the hunting conditions would be good, these animals were sitting there on the other end of the spectrum hoping that it would rain so that they could literally survive and make it through another harsh dry season. So that reality sort of, I guess, sunk in and was just a pretty interesting reminder as to how harsh Mother Nature can be. But we, euthanized that scrubber and ended up rounding out the afternoon by moving in the opposite direction. Honestly, the trend for that day in particular seemed to be that just as we'd see a boar or come across a good bit of sign, the wind would swirl and those boars would end up running out of the creek. And eventually, through a lot of persistence, we wound around a really tight corner in the creek, and up ahead we actually spotted a sow in a wet little bit of mud, and she'd obviously been enjoying a bit of a wallow. And whilst it was just a sow, it was one of the first instances where it was a pig that we actually were able to walk onto, sort of spot, stalk, glass, get in on and go, okay, it's just a sow, and sort of move off from without actually being winded. And that was the first time that that had happened for quite a while. Like every other pig that we'd seen, we'd get a glimpse of for a second. As soon as we saw it, you'd feel the wind shift. And just having that happen actually sort of gave us a little bit of promise for the next and what was ultimately the last probably couple 100 meters of this creek before it turned into some rocky escarpment country. So add to this, we were finally seeing some really promising amounts of sign. Like there were some good tracks, fresh mud, beds all along the creek. So we actually moved forwards pretty expectingly, and only 100 or so yards further as it would happen. As I stepped forwards, looking around a bit of a new section of the creek where the bank was uncovered, unfortunately, to my horror, I actually spotted the whites of a toothy boar's tusks. And where I say unfortunately is because that's obviously a good thing. He was alert, very much alert, facing our direction. And as quickly as I'd sort of taken that step and seen him, he'd obviously seen me because he was dead facing my direction. And just the time of the afternoon by that point, I dare say he was in a light sleep, sort of looking our direction, and he'd probably heard us for the last 100 meters as we walked up along the bank, just because, again, it was so noisy. So where I do say, fortunately, I guess, is that I was able to recognize that it was a boar and a pig very, very quickly. And rather than take an extra step, I was able to stop motionless. And again, maybe because I did stop, the boar actually rose to his feet. He sort of stood there, standing there, and then he just listened for about probably 30 or 40 seconds before he slowly turned and started to move off down the creek. And he pretty quickly sort of vanished behind a bank that was, just behind him there. So I actually signaled for Brad, who was with us. He had this little pig squealer that he uses. It's like a cottontail reed caller sort of thing. And I actually signaled for him to let out basically a pig squeal just to, imitate a boar fighting or pigs fighting or some sort of commotion, just a natural sort of sound. And in all honesty, the thought that I had behind this was that for us, the wind was actually good. Like, he definitely hadn't winded us. He'd only seen a tiny little glimpse of movement. And from what I could tell, again, because I could only see him for literally one step, that it was one step of movement. And I assumed that when he walked around that bank, he was basically just putting himself between an unknown threat at that point. He'd seen something, maybe heard something, and that was about the extent of it. But what was most interesting to me is that when he went around that bank, I could have swore that he had some swollen testes or testicles. So what to me that tells me is that, and maybe because he was in such close proximity to that sow, she might have been in season or another sow might have been in season nearby, that he was a little bit, horny. There was some sort of rutting activity going on. It might not have been the case, but basically that later sort of observation paired with the fact that he might not have known actually what that movement was or what he'd seen made me think it was a good opportunity to do that call. Like, I didn't really think it could hurt. So Brad blew on the cottontail reed whistler, whatever you want to call it, and he, made some sounds that really did sound like a couple of pigs fighting and bluing. And then we gave it about a minute or so and then slowly moved forward searching for that boar after he didn't sort of come into us. And they don't really come into you unless they're fully rutted up. But what I can say is that as soon as we sort of got around another 100 meters and we crested that bank towards where that boar had sort of disappeared to, at a mere 10 meters below us in the creek, it was really that tight sort of close quarter action, as I said earlier. I'd noticed what was a bit of a ripple in some of the water in the creek below me. And the bank was that steep that it sort of actually had hid our approach and maybe even some of the movement and noise that we'd had getting in that last 100 meters. But it also hid what was creating that, disturbance or that ripple in the water. So, I was sort of sitting there trying to look for a pig, and when I couldn't really see it and I was virtually standing over this animal looking right down into the water, I couldn't see anything. So I was starting to think that it might have actually been, like a bird, some sort of heron or a night egret or something like that, or even a frog swimming across there, or, whatever it may have been, a cane toad. I quickly changed that thinking when I actually saw a boar or a feral pig's tail swish. And what must have happened is that he was in there in a bit of a wallow in his bed under the cave, and it had etched out further than I could actually see. And as he began to emerge, I actually ducked down just so that as he came out of that wallow into the creek sort of centre or proper, that he wouldn't be able to see me silhouetted on the creek bank. As I ducked, I quickly got an arrow out of the quiver, placed it on the string, and I sort of, again, this is all just guessing, but watching as he moved up and out of the creek, he wasn't disturbed. He was just sort of making his way up, moseying out of the creek. I was able to watch, and as soon as he pulled up broadside at about 15 metres, I ended up pulling off a nice little shot, and the arrow, the day 6 shaft and Kayuga Adventures passed through both lungs, and it was a clean pass through, going out through the boar, exiting the bank beyond, and that boar made it probably 15 metres again past the shot before expiring to what was a lethal shot. So that was great news for us. It was honestly a lot of reward for a lot of effort after a massive day hunting the creek up there in Cape York, Australia. And again, walking up to the hog, if it wasn't the boar that we'd put up from the bed 100 metres earlier, he certainly was another exceptional toothy boar with, a few inches, 2 to 3 inches of tusk hanging out of the jaw. So it was the exact same type and sort of age class of feral pig that we're after on this trip. And to cap off day one with a boar after all that effort and a few disappointing stalks where things just got, winded before we really even had an opportunity, it was great as a bit of a confidence booster leading into day 2 to get that pig on the deck.
If you're an Aussie hunter, you already know those early starts are brutal. Rolling out of the swag at 4 a.m, freezing cold, eyes half shut, and all you want is a coffee that actually hits. That's why I use Dog and Gun coffee. Roasted here in Australia, Dog and Gun makes coffee for people who live outdoors. Hunters, fishers, campers, the whole lot. Their brews are strong, smooth, and pack enough punch to get you moving up the mountain before first light. And the best part, you can get it as beans, grounds, or lightweight instant sachets that actually taste like real coffee when you're on the mountain. Whether you're heading bush for a week or just brewing up home before work, Dog and Gun keeps you fueled for whatever adventure you're chasing. Check them out at dogandguncoffee.com and use code TWIN10 to get $10 off your first order and upgrade your camp coffee today.
So, as is the case with this time of year, the following day started off a whole lot different for us. Overnight, even on the way back, getting back to camp, it had downpoured with some areas, scattered across the property, which is about 600,000 acres. Much of the property received upwards of 20 millimetres of rain. So that's quite good rain. Not going to change things up too much in terms of access at that point, with much of the countryside being so dry and the dry temperatures and things. But it definitely did mean that our strategy for the next day had changed. So what I mean by that is that rather than, just go and say, yep, blindly we're going to go and do that waterhole, because they were good yesterday or whatever, or the creek was good, we're going to go back and check out that area. Our strategy for this morning was to basically just drive and travel by car and try and find the areas which seemed most dry. And again, it wasn't really rocket science. We literally just drove the tracks, which some tracks just go for hours and hours to the back corners of the property. But it was to drive the tracks in a direction where basically instead of mud flicking up on the rear guard of the tyres, it was eventually swapped and we started getting dry dust being left behind the car. And that basically told us that, as I said earlier, whilst it was 600,000 acres to hunt on and there was quite a good downpour the night before, there were obviously going to be some areas that didn't get any rainfall. And that's what we were targeting, is those areas that things wouldn't have changed. Like it would have been, very much dry conditions, and those pigs and animals would have been reliant on water. So our first walk wasn't actually until sort of mid-morning by the time we actually found an area that seemed a little bit drier, and it actually pointed us in the complete different direction from the previous afternoon where we'd walk that creek. This was on a different corner of the property, and leaving the road behind and where we parked the car, we actually walked into a section of paperbark swamps, which Brad had sort of pointed out to us that because it was dry on the roads, this area had a few scattered water sources amongst these paperbarks, and it'd be a good spot for us to go and look for a boar. So fortunately for us, even with the overnight rain, again, the temperatures were still pretty warm and hot, which meant that the animals were heading into those water sources to drink and bed down within close proximity. So the way I like to think of it, I guess, is, like anyone who's gone for a run or may have experienced going for a workout or even just doing something physical, so you get a bit of a sweat up, you're a bit hot and sticky, and then rather than going home and jumping straight in the shower where, I know that when I'm hot, I've gone for a run or a workout and then I get into the shower. Even if I have a cold shower, I try and dry myself with that towel, and it seems like you're still sweating, you're still hot, you've still got that level of like moisture on you, and you actually feel a bit more, even though you're clean, you almost feel a little bit sticky and gross because you still got that effects of just how hot and wet you were before you got in the shower. And this was a little bit same, if I can give you guys a bit of a picture as to what it was like hunting this day. With so much moisture in the air from the night's rainfall, the humidity was through the roof. And I think this honestly kept pigs, because it didn't quite get up to like 40 degrees temperature, just say. It was probably more that mid-30s, lower 30s, but it was stinking hot and humid. And like we really found that quite a few pigs were on these water sources wallowing, and then would only be bedded, 20 or 30 metres off the water sources. So pretty shortly after, going for this walk, we actually spotted a mob of pigs just off the edge of a water source. And as we closed in, weaving through all these paperbarks, we pretty quickly realised there wasn't actually a shooter amongst them. There was no mature boar, which was a bit disappointing. But just as we were sort of set to keep progressing and weave our way around this mob of pigs, we sort of turned back to where we'd sort of just come, looking back on the other corner of the waterway, and actually what was hidden by a bit of a lip of the water source, or that sort of bank of the dam, was a really toothy old boar laying in a wallow. And what probably gave him up in the end was that there are a few egrets, those white cattle egrets that often follow buffalo, cattle, pigs, you name it. They sort of follow those larger terrestrial animals. There are a couple of them perched up right beside him. There was one actually standing on him, and yeah, identifying that this boar was a toothy old boar, the hunt was on. So he was really, without having a better way to describe him, poor as piss, basically, with hardly any meat or muscle on his old sort of frame. I dare say, whether it was me or the time of year, it was probably going to be his last dry season. And what was, I guess, immediately evident was just his tusks. Like, he had really, really good tusks. He was an old boar. What little teeth he probably had left in his skull, he definitely had some tusks there. So I sort of wasted little time closing in on the pig, using what bank had sort of hidden him very much for the last little part as we closed in on that family mob. I actually used that same bank to duck back around and sneak into 30 metres pretty quickly. And just as I think he sensed that we were there and was trying to get up and out of the mud, I drew back and was able to settle the pin on the vitals, and I was able to take out both of his lungs. Also, I dare say, with that day 6 shaft and Kayuga broadheads, again, being a super well-constructed broadhead, have no issue shooting through bone, and I dare say the shot broke his offside shoulder or broke the scapula, and this dropped him on the spot. The arrow virtually struck him and knocked him clean off his feet, as if he was shot with a rifle, and he was down and out pretty quickly. And walking over to the boar and retrieving him from the mud, it was actually shocking how poor he was once we were up close. We knew skinny, but when we got up there and sort of laid hands on him and dragged him out of the mud, his backbones were showing, his leg muscles had atrophied, and he barely probably weighed even 35 kilos. Like, even in the thick boggy mud on the edge of the waterhole, he wasn't difficult to sort of drag out of the mud, which, sort of shows it was probably just the epitome of the current landscape and how harsh those animals were doing it. And literally that boar and everything else, all the other pigs that we were seeing, were basically holding on, praying for the rains and the green grass and the wet season to come and just basically save them. They were holding out, buying, every day, trying to get to that point where it was no longer a struggle, and hopefully that rain would bring with it some feed and a bit of relief from the heat. And yeah, it really was a bit sad to see, but I was definitely stoked that it was a nice old boar and super quick, clean kill, which was also great. Following on from that successful, hunt conversion in the paperbarks, we shifted spots again, having checked out all those water sources. And the next location for the day was based off the same success that we had the previous day, walking a big, slow walk around a bit of a creek and a spring. And this time we decided to do very much the same thing, but because we're in a different corner of the property, this spring or creek basically was a lot more drier and rockier with these big, large pebbles at the bottom of it. So once again, similar to that morning, this site had very little rain compared to other areas of the property that we sort of had driven through. And to be honest, we started walking with the wind in our face, and with a very similar thought in mind, we came across, face to face with a young dingo pup. So he was obviously doing the same thing, either just walking along the top bank of the creek or hunting. But he basically walked right up past us at around 20 yards before he caught our scent, seeing what we were doing, a bit of a loop, and he caught our scent and took off at around 20 yards. But that was cool to see. Just reminded us that we were in a pretty remote, cool part of Australia. Seeing those animals interact and do their things naturally was pretty cool. But what sort of transpired, it started getting to the hotter part of the day. And again, we were trying to drink as much Atlas Wild and as much water as possible, having the odd snack here and there. But the next hour or two, it was just one of those days and those hunts where you sort of find yourself constantly questioning what you're actually doing. We weren't really seeing anything. You'd see the odd little bit of sign, just enough to sort of keep you interested, but probably not enough to tell you that you're in the right areas. But anyway, we'd probably travelled around maybe a kilometre, maybe a little bit further, and we hadn't even seen a single pig to that point. Like fresh off the bat, we saw that dingo, and then very little from there on out. And that's sort of when, again, I was probably thinking it. I know James was thinking it behind the camera. Don't know what Brad and Dad were thinking, but that's when a whistle sort of came from our far right, and Brad had done the whistle just to let us know that something was going on. And again, like hearing that was a bit of a, oh, cool, sweet, what have we got going on? And he, from where we were, he had actually dropped. He wasn't far away. He was probably only 30 metres away. We were on the high bank on the left, and he had just dropped down on our right, and he was in the creek proper. Like he was down in the creek just so that he could see a bit more what was going on. That was our strategy. And then we figured if he scared anything, or if he, walked around a corner and there was something in the creek, they might run up the bank, and we, James and I on the left, or Dad on the far, far right, might have been able to, get a shot as that pig pulled up on the creek bank. Worst case, we were in a good spot to be able to look from our left-hand side onto the right creek bank, and Dad from the right creek sort of bank up on top. He would have been able to look down into the creek on the left. So we're in a good little triangle of, hunters. And basically by getting notified of this whistle, that there was something in front of us, we looked at Brad, and he sort of, signaled for us to come in a bit closer. So we slowly crept over in that direction, sort of closing in on the bank. And in all honesty, it wasn't until we were nearly on top of the actual boar that we saw him. And again, just those tight corded, slowly snaking sort of creeks and springs up there in Cape York. This boar was basically nestled into the soft sand along the bank, and he sort of lay there like dead to the world. Like he had no idea that Brad was there, probably 30 metres away, that I was now there at like 10 to 15 metres away. But where he was bedded, he was on a really obscure angle to me. Like he was basically bedded on his side perfectly. And from where I was, all I could see was the top and back of his head, and then the spine. And that was pretty much it. So what I did, again, knowing a little bit about their anatomy and using his ear as a bit of an indicator as to where to aim on this boar, I drew back, I settled the pin, and again, this is where it's massive, but trusting my arrow setup. So a good quality shaft in the day 6 shafts that I'm running, as well as a really great broadhead, the Kayuga Zot, 150 grain. And then obviously the combination of that plus my bow, which is an 80-pound Hoyt Carbon RX9, I didn't really have any doubts that I was going to be able to penetrate and put a good shot through this boar. So at full draw, I settled the pin, and the shot flew true, and that arrow zipped through that hog, and he teared off up the creek. And with a really solid blood trail, we found that boar toppled over around 80 metres away, I'd say. The arrow was complete pass-through, which is great. Pretty much entered in the top of his scapulars, down through the lungs, and then out near his pizzle. And that was an absolutely amazing shot for one. Like I was really happy with that I was able to assess where everything was with a really tight sort of, because the other alternative was that I would have tried to take another step or two in the wrong direction, trying to get or make or force a shot, and then that boar gets up and runs away, and I do a rush shot, or that boar runs away and the wind swirls or something like that. So again, that's just one of those instances where for me, I'm able to say that, with the gear that I shoot, with that arrow and broadhead combination, the bow that I shoot, the proficiency that I have with shooting has improved to the point where, you sort of pass that one up, chalk that one up to just the gear that you use being able to buy you more shots. And it wasn't that it's an unethical shot, it's just that it's something that I practice for and know that I can achieve. And in this instance, it worked out perfectly. Introducing the Walk and Stalk Carbon Game Bar and Lift Kit. Lightweight, rugged, and with multi-function design, it's an incredible 7-in-1 do-it-all tool, with benefits before the kill, during the hunt, as well as when the animal hits the deck. Use as a trekking pole in rough terrain. Spot game easier with the monopod-like function. Shoot from a stable rest with the V-shape stabilization. Attach a smartphone or camera for self-filming and photography. Drag critters with ease and haul to a convenient location. Prop the legs open for gutting or disarticulating the hams. And finally, hang the animal using their compact pulley lift kit, easily lifting game animals up to 200 kilograms in weight. We have tested it on chital deer and fallow deer here in Australia, used it in the USA on a range of game animals such as mule deer, pronghorn, and even a bull elk. Want to try it for yourself? Use code TWIN15 at checkout for 15% off your next order. These are absolutely essential for those hunters looking to maximise field butchery and have cleaner, more hygienic meat back at home for the freezer. The last little bit of this hunt actually rounds out the trip for me and story time for me today on this podcast. There is actually a little bit more action over the next few days, but I'll leave that for another time simply because I know that James is doing a podcast next week. Brad and Matt are going to be doing a podcast the following week, and we're going to have a number of different films coming out over the next few months. So I'll just finish off, this day because I ended up taking 3 boars for the day, which was, no easy feat, but definitely not uncommon for a trip up in Cape York. It is a bow hunter's paradise when it comes for pigs, and especially at Kayuga Adventures, they just run a quality outfit. Both Matt, who is the owner, and Brad, who's one of the head guides, are just, so much expertise and knowledge when it comes to this countryside, the animals that they're hunting, as well as just genuine, really good blokes, but really have amazing ethics and values when it comes to hunting. And they do definitely, I think anyone that goes on their trips, even for James and I, who I'd say are experienced hunters and bow hunters especially, you go on these trips and you learn something from other people and you take that away. And that's just how we should all be, I guess, as hunters, is whenever we go on a trip, hoping to learn something new and being able to replicate that and use that on future trips. And then obviously with me, I guide people through spotted safaris and the chital deer hunts. If I can then teach people some of these lessons I've learned and things that, every time I go out in the bush try and improve on, it just creates this culture where everyone's getting better as hunters, hopefully more ethical, taking better shots, using better gear, enjoying their time in the outdoors more and more. And that's honestly what I can say from this trip. It was a really great trip. And for me, it ended on a high note, which was great. So already taking those 2 boars for the day, as light was beginning to fade and that last hour of daylight sort of loomed, we made a quick dash out of that creek to one last waterhole that was nearby. And to be honest, we pulled up pretty close to it, probably about 200-300 meters away, because there was a fair bit of timber between us and that waterhole. And Brad just basically pointed us in that direction and said, "Yep, it's just in front of you there." The wind was actually really good. It had almost looked as if it was going to start raining again. I think we did even get a little bit of spitting and rainfall on us towards the end of this stalk. But as we approached that dam or that waterhole, the sounds of a squeal sort of erupted here and there. And it wasn't, to be honest, the sound of, 2 boars, 2 mature pigs fighting. Instead, it was probably more of a high-pitched sort of squeal and little grunts of younger pigs. But for us, it was good. We were heading into a waterhole. To know that there were pigs there was always a good thing. So once we actually caught a bit of a break in that thick scrub that I was describing, we finally laid eyes on what was a small family mob of pigs on a carcass. And once again, if you only looked at the body size of these animals, you would have thought it was a small mob of sows and suckers, but we weren't that easily deceived. And on glassing the mob a bit more carefully, one pig sort of appeared a little bit different, and it was pretty quickly identified that not only was it a boar with a pizzle, he had some pretty decent hooks, but again, he was no bigger than 40 kilos, very much mix it up, being slightly bigger, if anything, than some of these sows. So they were, again, all in pretty poor condition. And despite being, a good boar, something that, if it was anywhere else, if it was in the Northern Territory or New South Wales, I'd probably just walk past it thinking it was a sick young pig. But this boar definitely had some good hooks. And the way that he was sort of orientated was he was in the middle, basically hooking away on the best bits of the rotten cow carcass. And where this cow lay on the flat was just off the water course, probably about 30 to 40 metres off the water. And then surrounding that, he was basically in no man's land. And what I mean by that, it was just basically like a lawn of not even grass because it was so dry. It was basically just dirt, leaves, and then one lone tree. And it was pretty obvious to me at that point that it was going to be a really slow and methodical stalk from the get-go. So we pretty quickly, again with a bit more commotion and squealing going on, noticed that there were a few more pigs in the scrub to our left. The way we were sort of looking, if you imagine we're in the middle of a clock, and then that boar was at 12, at 9, 9 to 10 and 11, there were more pigs, undisclosed pigs in that scrub. And rather than try and get in the scrub where it would have been really dry, thick, noisy, I actually elected to move in the open pretty much from the center of the clock to 12 and take that more exposed open route and try and rely on a more slow and deliberate sort of stalk with very subtle movements. Almost, to be honest, a bit like a chiddle deer hunt where you just, one step glass. And it very much was like that. It was literally 1 foot in front of the other for James and myself. I had the bow and James obviously had the camera, and we had to close the gap from about 100 metres to ideally 30, which would have put me in bow range of this boar. And as it was set out in front of us at 35 metres, I would pretty much get to what was the last cover or the only cover on this stalk, which was a single tree. It was just one big dead sort of tree just in the middle of those pigs and then the water course. So between me and that tree, I had to also sneak through about 15 pigs. Plenty of masked lapwings or plovers people might be familiar with, which love to obviously give up an alarm call and ruin stalks and even swoop you at times. And hopefully all along that, if the wind could remain a little bit consistent, then that would obviously give us a chance. So with a plan set, we broke the distance down and put everything into motion. So our only real, burden, aside from those things that I've laid out, was that halfway through the stalk, as we were sort of getting in a bit closer and everything was looking pretty likely, another pig, which was in the brush on the left, which I explained earlier, it was a young boar, had sort of broken out from that mob, and he'd actually joined the party halfway through and sort of come in and joined where that more dominant boar was feeding on the cow. And what happened was, because he came in, that boar sort of livened up a little bit and sort of was doing half circles around the cow, trying to keep him off it. And that caused a little bit of commotion. So his arrival actually caused a fair few of the other pigs, including some of the sows, to actually sort of scatter and move, and they all changed positions. And rather than be head down feeding on the carcass where the boar tolerated them, now they were sort of all up and on their feet, moving around the carcass. And for me, I was basically, as I said, in no man's land now at probably 50 metres away. And to be honest, a few actually looked at me basically in the middle of nowhere, and they just stared right at me for a second or two. But, with no motion, we just stayed motionless and trusting in our camouflage. They eventually sort of, looked back at the carcass, the commotion of the other pigs moving around, distracted them, and eventually they went back to feeding. And, with another slow 20 or so meters forward, we were able to find ourselves at that last tree, that last little bit of cover. When we got there, we were now at about 35 meters. As I said, we pre-ranged it earlier just so we knew that it was all possible. And from our position, just as some of the sows and suckers actually began to leave the carcass and head into that scrub that I mentioned earlier and head back into that to bed down, with less pigs between me and that boar that I was trying to shoot, he was pretty much now one of the only ones on the carcass. I actually used that as an opportunity to break that last cover. So rather than stay at 35 and try and, shoot, I thought an extra 5 yards here or there would be perfect. So I edged around the left-hand side of the tree, trying to use it as a bit of cover. And when he sort of faced half quartering away, I was able to slip in a little bit closer and got to about 30 meters. When the boar as he was feeding on that cow, extended his front leg forward, just opening that shot a little bit more. I drew back and again settled the pin and threaded that shot. And honestly, it wasn't really a surprise to me. I've been practicing with the bow pretty hardcore for America. I used that momentum from that trip to keep everything pretty dialed in. And to be honest, this shot was pretty much a perfect textbook heart shot on another quality ball, which was really good. So with that, the ball probably ran, I don't know, maybe 40 or so yards and expired, if that, maybe 20 or 30 to be honest. And he just expired in the scrub. Some of the sows didn't really know what was going on and they just walked off. And with that, it was pretty much darkness by the time we got up and over to him, retrieved the arrow, and signed off on another magical day in Cape York. So that virtually wrapped up my hunting during our time over there at Kayuga Adventures. So for you guys listening, hopefully you guys have enjoyed this. But for more from this hunt, please stay tuned for next week's episode with James. He's going to do Cape York Boars part 2 and recount some of his successful stories from, again, what was an amazing trip for him. A bit of a breaker here. He gets amongst some equally toothy boars, shooting a few handy boars. And yeah, it was amazing to be behind the camera and celebrate those success stories with him. So stay tuned for his version of what goes down in the following days. And of course, all of this footage that, I've just discussed has been captured will be shared with you all on our YouTube channel. So please make sure that you guys subscribe to stay up to date there and relive this action once it's delivered to your screens.
A good backpack turns hard country into possible country. When the terrain gets serious, your pack becomes the only thing you can't afford to get wrong. That's why we use and believe in Eberlestock. Eberlestock has been making backpacks for 40 years and is trusted by tens of thousands of hunters and hikers worldwide. Their customizable packs and bino harnesses show exquisite attention to detail and years of refinement to make the ultimate backpack range. We use the Vapor 2500 for our day hunts and Vapor 5000 for our backpack hunts. If you're in the market for a new pack or bino harness, check out Venture Hunting and Outdoors in-store or online to see the full range of Eberlestock gear. You won't be disappointed.
It's that time of the show where we get to answering your FAQs. It's a FAQ segment, and for those that aren't familiar, that means frequently asked questions by you, our listeners. So if you have any questions following this podcast, then please do send us an email with the subject line FAQ to info@twinelements.com.au, or simply send either James, myself, or the Twin Elements social media accounts a DM with your question, and we will all strive to answer them for a future episode of Twin Elements podcast. We do also plan to do a rut and Red Deer Raw specific FAQ in about a month's time. So as you're listening to this, if you've got a question that you want answered, please make sure that you send it in to us. Give us a little bit of time to put our thoughts together, and we will answer that. And hopefully those questions will help you guys out. We know that from previous podcasts, the FAQ segments are one of the best received. I think that if one person has a question, often is the case that another 10 that are maybe a little bit too, embarrassed to ask will have that same question, behind the scenes. And we often get a lot of feedback saying that was a great question. I've been thinking the same thing on my block. So thanks for answering that. If you do have a question, even if you think it's a bit silly, please send them through to us. We really do get value out of helping people, and we love sharing in everyone's success stories. We love being tagged in successful hunts, all of that type of stuff, just building up the Australian hunting community. So without any further delay, we will get into the first question, which is sent in by Carson Rost. So, Ayden, did you take your elk with a 600 grain arrow setup or lighter? Day 6 are great arrows, but get heavy quick. In Oz and for closer shots, it's not a problem, but if you have to stretch the shot out, did you feel it handicapped? 80 or 70 pound bow. Alrighty, so as you would have heard, there's a great series of questions by this listener. So thank you very much, Carson. One for just, your interpretation of, that elk hunt, and you sending in those questions. Like it's genuinely really interesting to me having these sort of chats and conversations. Like I sent Carson a message back just letting him know a reply to this, but then I figured it was actually a really good question and opportunity to just explain my thoughts and rationale behind sort of the setup that I do. So I figure that I'll run through and answer his questions, I guess, more directly initially, and then I'll try and use that information to chat further and give a bit more of an explanation as to why I do. So did you take your elk with a 600 grain arrow setup? So the setup that I'm shooting comes in total arrow weight at around 575 grains, which includes obviously the broadhead and everything, fletching and stuff, and the collar and outsert. So that is, just under the 600 grains, but very close to. And just for clarity, I guess, I shoot a Day 6 shaft, which is the 275 HD shafts. They're a bit of a hybrid between a 250 and a 300, and just I find works really well with my current setup. I then shoot a Kayuga 150 grain 2-blade Zot up front and have done so for many years. I just love how sharp I can get them and the fact that they're going to punch through bone pretty effortlessly, not really deviate or change trajectory when coming into contact with bone. And part of why I shoot this setup is because I'm shooting a 80-pound bow, which is my Hoyt Carbon RX9, and that honestly zips out the arrows pretty fast and hits bloody hard. So I guess now that I've outlined those specifics, I'll go more into arrow setups and some of the other questions or, things that our listener Carson has sort of asked in his question. And I guess the first thing I want to say is that when it comes to arrow setups specifically, everyone has differing opinions, different preferences, which is all completely fine. I just want to outline, for people that are about to listen to what I have to say and, may shoot differently, that arrows in general are a very subjective topic. So when Carson says that this arrow is heavy, my first question is heavy to who? At 575 grains to someone shooting 450 or 420, then my arrow is definitely heavy. But if someone's shooting 700 grains, then my arrow is probably light to some people. So I feel like with an arrow setup, it's definitely suited to the style of bow hunting that person does. And again, this is no means an attack on Carson. Like, I think his question is extremely valid, and some of the points he raises are really, really great and actually got me thinking and wanting to talk about why I shoot the setup that I do. So where Carson is correct is when he says that, stretching the shot may have implications, and that is absolutely correct, especially, with an arrow that is around that 600 grain mark. But for me, with that elk shot, I certainly didn't feel handicapped whatsoever. As I've explained on a couple of podcasts now, going back to, the Bull Elk Success one, as well as the USA wrap-ups and sort of lessons learnt. For me, at that time, even now, a 60-yard shot for me, and even the setup that I just ran through, is a relatively comfortable shot. Like, I'd shoot that at the target all the time. And particularly what made me super confident in that specific circumstance over there in the USA is the fact that that shot for me was at 60 yards and the animal was bedded and thus stationary. There was no way, no real opportunity that animal was going to get up and move or duck and react to an arrow coming its way. So the next thing I guess that's really important for me anyway when shooting at an animal is obviously making sure that there's a clear laneway. And just because of, the actual openness and just how it was so vast, and basically I was above the animal shooting down on him in a bit of a draw. He was bedded in an open spot. There was a tree that he was bedded below, but the tree canopy was way above where any arrow flight would have come in. So even though it was, as Carson has said, potentially like a heavy arrow, the trajectory of that arrow, because I've shot it at 60 yards, there was nothing that was going to, it wasn't going to hit a limb, wasn't going to hit any brush that I hadn't seen. I'd accounted for all these things and therefore, again, had no hesitancy, didn't feel handicapped by the arrow setup or anything whatsoever. As I said earlier, there was absolutely no way that bull was going to, move. He was always going to be there in the same position that I'd shot and executed the shot as when the arrow actually arrived and struck him. So again, under the given circumstances, I felt extremely comfortable taking that shot. And as you will see in the footage, as you would have heard on the podcast, that elk, I ended up shooting through both lungs, and he actually went around 10 yards up the bank and then stumbled back down, dying, around 5 yards from where I actually hit him with the arrow in his bed. So I guess that leads us now to, for me anyway, in my opinion, and I'm by no means an expert, but this is just what I've sort of gathered from shooting, hundreds of different arrow setups, broadhead setups over the years now, is that for me, when it comes to lighter versus heavier arrows, I would actually agree with Carson and say that day 6 shafts are probably on the heavier side. Personally for me though, that suits my hunting really, really well. For me, one, I like, getting really, really close. Like most of my shots on animals, as you would have heard, all these shots on these pigs were within 30 meters. Even at 30, I consider that sort of a bit of a far shot. But I do like heavier arrows as they seem to stabilize better out of the bow. They also, in my opinion, fly quieter. And I also find that despite being slower, generally get better penetration, less deflections, and actually allow for better sort of shot angles. Like for me, even on some of these bedded boar shots, say that boar that was bedded 10 to 15 yards in front of me and I had to shoot through basically nearly the top of his spine and scapula, and it came out near his pizzle, there's no way I'm doing that shot with a 400 grain arrow. And I know that, a 400 grain arrow might be better at an elk at 80 yards, but I very rarely put myself in that situation. Even on Sambadier, I wouldn't be caught shooting out far on a moving animal or an animal that's feeding. For me, and this 60 meter shot at an elk, which was by far my furthest shot, it was bedded. I'd ranged and saw which way his rib cage was sort of arching, knew that where I put my arrow, which I was shooting proficiently, would lead to an effective kill with my setup. Like there was a lot of inputs that I measured, assessed, and again, without really any adrenaline, was able to say, yep, that in my opinion is an ethical shot. Let that arrow fly. It hit pretty much exactly where I was aiming, and that elk was dead 5 meters from where I hit him with the arrow, less than a minute later. So perfect outcome. Whether it would have been the same with a different arrow setup, that's, I don't know. I dare say it wouldn't have been. But again, I was confident with that setup. Where I did notice that the day 6 shafts were, again, leading to what Carson was saying, probably a little bit heavier, and where I, will learn for next time and won't probably use them, and why I don't shoot over 30 meters often is that, at that 30 to 40 meter yards range on moving animals or fast moving animals like pronghorn, where 30 meters is a long shot for me, that's probably where a lighter, flatter shooting arrow may have been better for those fast moving animals, especially, if there are people out there wanting to shoot chittle deer at 50 or 40 and they're moving through, even though it's open scrub, they're moving, and the difference between a 32 meter shot that you think you've ranged properly and the animal's actually at 38 might be, 2 or 3 inches of arrow drop at that distance. So that's where I think, again, if you're shooting out past 30, it matters more. But for me, because most of my shots are less than 30, and even when I'm shooting out past 30, I'm ranging the animals very specifically. I'm ranging them when they're stationary. If they move again, I re-range, make sure that, like, I'm not the type of person that's just going to force a shot. I'm always, I think, very hesitant to do so, and much rather would see that animal walk away than put in a shot that's going to, miss its mark or be altered by a miss range or whatever. So I guess also in saying that, I was able to shoot my pronghorn through the heart at 44 yards. So with that day 6 shaft setup. So yes, whilst it might be a little bit heavy, again, at 44 yards, I was able to get an exact range on a nice pronghorn buck and sent the shot, settled the pin and had a complete pass through his heart. And again, without any issues whatsoever, I was able to claim another critter over there in the USA with that setup. So once again, to wrap it all up, arrow setups in general are all very, very subjective. Like everyone's going to have their own different opinions. But hopefully that little bit of an explanation behind my rationale and why I like those setups helps answer your question, Carson, but hopefully someone else out there with, a similar mindset. I think that here in 2026 with, a whole range, 50 odd episodes ahead of us for the year, James and I might try and actually aim to get an expert on to talk more in depth about arrow setups and arrows and just go into weight, wall thickness, spine, all these different things, inserts, outserts, fletchers, veins, whatever it may be, just so that, you guys, our listeners, it's going to hopefully assist with your hunting, your proficiency as archers as well. And secondly, it'll be interesting for James and I as well, most importantly, which is sort of why we also do this podcast, is to be learning ourselves. So, alrighty, that wraps up today's podcast. Once again, thank you very much for sending in those questions. If you're new here, being the start of 2026, then please check out our Twin Elements YouTube channel. That's primarily where we drop most of our bigger, longer form content, where you can get to know who James and I are as hunters and outdoorsmen. We are dropping a hunting film over there every Wednesday evening from 6 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time. So simply search the Twin Elements YouTube channel, and then please make sure that you continue to like, comment, and subscribe over there. Next up, please check out our website. We've worked long and hard on getting that up and running, and we have some cool stories and little recounts over there in a written visual form. We also have plenty of images and recipes with different foods and cuts of venison, wild fish, wild source protein sources, throwing it right back to the Hungry Hunter days where James and I filmed a few cooking series. So there's some cool little recipes that you guys can share with your family and friends over there. Plus, most importantly, James and I have over 40 epic prints up for sale. There's some stunning shots of wildlife, scenery, and moments from the wild and our adventures. So please do check those out. Those print purchases directly help support James and I here at Twin Elements and keep us doing what we do here behind the scenes. And lastly, please continue to subscribe, review, and rate the podcast. We hope everyone had a Merry Christmas and a great break over the New Year's period. James and I are obviously keen to keep the momentum going with the podcast here into 2026. And I'll sign off by just saying that if anyone has any questions, any topics, anything that you guys want to discuss, please email them through to us at info@twinelements.com.au. Even if you simply want to get in touch with us, just head over there or to our socials. We try and be pretty active and reply to all your messages. And we love being interactive and getting to know you guys, our listeners, viewers, supporters, whatever it is and whatever social media platform. We are truly thankful for all of your support. You're a bunch of legends. So we will see you all next week on the Twin Elements podcast. Catch you guys.